ways that I might not sin with my tongue. I will guard my mouth with a muzzle so long as the wicked are in my presence. I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail, and my distress grew worse. My heart became hot within me as I mused. The fire burned, and I spoke with my tongue. O Lord, make me to know my end, and what is the measure of my days. Let me know how fleeting I am. Behold, you have made my days a few handbreadth, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. Surely for nothing they are in turmoil. Man heaps up wealth and does not know who will gather. And now, O Lord, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. Deliver me from all my transgressions. Do not make me the scorn of the fool. I am mute. I do not open my mouth, for it is you who have done it. Remove your stroke from me. I am spent by the hostility of your hand. When you discipline a man with rebukes for sin, you consume like a moth what is dear to him. Surely all mankind is a mere breath. Hear my prayer, O Lord, and give ear to my cry. Hold not your peace at my tears, for I am a sojourner with you, a guest like all my fathers. Look away from me, that I may smile again before I depart and am no more. This is from the 39th Psalm, a lament psalm, as we continue our study this week on the Psalms of Lament. A couple quick things before we jump into this psalm is to know that psalms are poetry, and that's going to come into play in a really important way in this psalm. That the actual structure of the psalm, not just the words, but the structure of the psalm, how it's written, how the lines are written, is actually going to contribute to the meaning and the significance and the weight of the psalm. And what we're going to see in the structure is how poetic lines are written. And I'll talk about that in a few moments. The next thing we need to remember is that lament is a form of psalm that is saying in prayer, bringing into prayer, everything is not okay. Everything is not okay. And what Psalms of Lament help us do is they help us to not be fake or pretend. That we are not the kind of people who pretend that everything is okay. Faith is not optimism. Faith is not optimism. The authors of a lament talk a lot about hope. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. Optimism is just a generic sense that circumstances will work out well. And the Bible makes no such promises that circumstances will just work out well. But what the scriptures promise is that we can hope in God. That hope is directed and pointed towards a person, at least in the scriptures. And so what the psalmists do with lament psalms is they cultivate hope. They point our hopes in God, and they avert our eyes away from our circumstances and to God himself. And so, and how they do that is by helping us articulate our dark, uncomfortable, unsettled feelings, and they bring those into prayer. And really what that's meant to do is to say and to communicate to us, one, that God gives us permission to pray this way, to speak to him this way, that there's no dark thought, there's no uncomfortable feeling, there's nothing that we feel or think that cannot be brought to God in prayer. And in fact, that's the proper place to bring it, to not pretend, to not hide, but to bring it to God. So that's really what lament does. And lament is going to be a healing balm, food for the soul, the wounded and broken and hurting soul. And so the Psalms of Lament are really meant to be a gift to us. And we're going to see that in this 39th Psalm. So let's jump into the structure of the Psalm and kind of get a sense of how this Psalm is written. There's going to be, the first 6 verses are going to be written in 3 lines, what's called a triad. Then the next 4 verses are going to be written in 2 lines, which is called a dyad. Then we go back to 2 verses of 3 lines, then 2 verses of 2 lines. 6 verses of 3 lines, 4 of 2 lines, 2 of 3 lines, 2 of 2 lines. So a 3-line verse is called a triad. And a 3-line verse, really what it's meant to communicate is destabilization. Something's unstable. There's a sense of surprise. There's a sense of something's coming unexpectedly. And so the 3 lines are starting us off right out the gates with something is unstable here. And then a 2-line structure, a dyad, is meant to communicate something different. It's a parallelism, and it's meant to communicate symmetry and balance. Symmetry and balance. And so something is stable. A parallel line, a dyad, is meant to communicate stability, and a triad is meant to communicate instability. And so what we're going to be experiencing throughout the structure of the poem and this prayer is the psalmist is going to move from stability to instability, and instability to stability. And it's this movement of the structure that's actually helping us understand the meaning and significance. And so let's look first at the first 6 verses of 3 lines, the first set of this poem, which really kind of sets the context of the prayer. And what we're going to see is this first 6 verses have to do with silence, that the psalmist is going to take a vow of silence. And one thing, maybe some of your Bibles, before I jump into this, some of your Bibles will actually show the structure. And if you can see on my Bible here, that there's the first 6 verses are all going to come in 3 lines, and then these next ones are going to be in 2 lines. And you can actually see, some translations do a good job of holding that structure so you can actually see it with your eyes. But the first 6 verses, he makes a vow of silence. I said, I will guard my ways, that I may not sin with my tongue. I'm going to be watchful with what I say. I'm not going to speak. I will guard my mouth with a muzzle. I'm going to muzzle myself so long as the wicked are in my presence. So here's really where we're going to get to the crux of what's going on in this psalm. He's got these dark thoughts, something that's unsettled, these thoughts that are very uncomfortable and potentially very dangerous thoughts. And he refuses to share them, we're told, because of the wicked that are in his presence. Now, we're not told why quite yet, why he doesn't want to share these thoughts with the wicked. But we can begin to speculate. Maybe the wicked are going to use these thoughts as a weapon against him. Maybe they're going to use it as a weapon against his faith. And many of us have had this experience, I think, that can identify with the psalmist here, that there's things that we feel or think or experience that are dark, are dangerous, are uncomfortable. And maybe we've shared those with people before, we've been vulnerable, and when we shared them, it was used against us. Somebody betrayed us with what we shared. Maybe we confessed something, and somebody used it against us. And the psalmist is afraid of that. He's afraid of wicked people who will use these dark thoughts against him. So he refuses to speak. But let's listen what happens to him because he refuses to speak. He actually lists off a sequence that, in other words, he tells us first, this was I was mute and silent. I held my peace to no avail. In the second verse, that there was it didn't profit me at anything. Why? He tells us, because my distress grew worse, my heart became hot within me, and as I thought, these words became a fire that burned me. In other words, what he's describing is his own inner being became like a volcano, like a volcano. These thoughts were burning him. In other words, what he's saying is, it kind of sent me into a tailspin. That these dark thoughts sent me into a tailspin in which I began to really experience inner suffering, a sort of inner hell in which this burning and torment, my thoughts were tormenting me. And so because of this, verse 3, then he says in that last verse, that last line of the verse, I spoke with my tongue. These thoughts are in triads in 3 lines because they're destabilizing, they're unstable thoughts. He's uncomfortable, and we're meant to feel the tension of these words. And he finally decides to turn and to speak. The volcano finally explodes. And he goes on to speak, but notice he speaks to God. He speaks to God. He turns away from the wicked and turns to God in prayer. Even his darkest thoughts become an act of faith. And he is going to invoke God. Oh Lord, make me to know my end. He can only face these dark thoughts with God's help. That's what he's saying. He can only face these dark thoughts with God's help. Well, what are these dark thoughts? Help me know what is the measure of my days, how fleeting I am. And he goes on to list a sequence of what these dark thoughts are all about. And they all have to do with how terrifyingly fleeting life can be. Measure my days, how fleeting I am. My days are a mere handspan. My lot is nothing. Everyone is a mere breath. Life is a shadow. Wealth is a breath. and you gather it up and it's lost. And so he lists off what he's experienced, that everything that felt stable and secure all of a sudden is gone and taken away. And man, I think we could really connect to that experience right now. Everything that felt stable all of a sudden in a moment is gone. And that's what he's describing. That's what he's experiencing. So these triadic lines are meant to give us this uncomfortable, destabilized experience that the psalmist is having. And then he's going to move into a sequence of 4 verses of 2 lines each. And these are meant to actually give us a sense of balance, of appropriateness. The form is meant to show us that God's response to this has been appropriate and balanced and measured. And so what he begins to unpack for us is actually his own sin. He's experiencing life this way because of his own sin. Deliver me from all my transgressions, he says. Do not make me the scorn of the fool. And he's going to list off these parallel sequences of lines. God alone can save me from this situation. And he vowed silence because we see now that it was going to be used against him, that this fool would scorn him for it. But while he was silent, he goes on, we notice that God is going to act. And how is God going to act? This is the darkest of all the thoughts. Remove your stroke or your blow from me. I am spent by the hostility of your hand. He realizes that his own sin has put him at war with God. At war with God. These are fighting words. God is hostile to him. God has struck him, has given him a blow. Well, what was that? And now we're going to move back into the destabilized 3 lines, the surprising element of the psalm, when we realize, verse 11, when you discipline with rebukes for sin, you consume like a moth what is dear to him, or you consume like a moth his wealth. Surely all mankind is but a breath. And here's the surprise of the psalm, what the psalmist is telling us here. I trusted in my wealth. I trusted in what I put my hope and my security and my faith in something that was not secure. I trusted my wealth, and the blow that God delivered, the way that God was hostile and acted against me, was he took all of my wealth away in a moment. And that's what he's saying. Everything was lost, and he realized in a moment how everything that he had trusted, everything that he put his hope in, was hollow, was empty, was ephemeral, was a breath. It had no stability. Wow, all of a sudden we get that's the lynch, the key to the passage and to the prayer. Wow, I trusted in all this stuff. I trusted in my wealth, and God took it all away. And so then he turns to the last 3 lines here in the 3-line verse here, and he asks God to hear him. And he lists it in 3 different ways. Hear my prayer, hearken to my cry, don't be deaf to my tears. He goes from a prayer which is articulate, to a cry which is inarticulate, to he can no longer even speak. All he has is tears. And he's asking God to respond to what he's observing in the psalmist. God, look at me, look at how I'm experiencing this. Please answer me. It's a plea to God. And then we go back to a parallel structure for the last 2 lines here. And he's going to give the rationale. This is the balanced, measured sense. Here's the reason why God should answer me. Here's the reason why God should hear me. He's going to tell us, I'm a sojourner and I'm a guest or a settler. In other words, he gives this sense of my life is so unstable, and God, there's only a limited amount of time I have to work with here, so please answer me quickly. And these reasons are on balance, good reasons for God to answer. And then he says, look away from me. This is actually different from Psalm 13 that we looked at yesterday. There, he asked God to turn his face toward him. Now he's asking God to look away. And that's I see this with my kids when they're in trouble. They've done something they know they shouldn't have. They have a hard time looking me in the face. And God is not far away here. God is painfully close. That's what look away from me means. And then he says, but God, don't keep disciplining me before I depart and am no more. There's only a limited time he has to work with here. And what's he asking for? Well, he doesn't actually tell us. He's just asking God to respond. He isn't trying to steer God's hand or even articulate what he needs, but he's entrusting God to respond in a way that is appropriate.